It's good to see you. I'm thankful that God's providence has allowed us to come together this morning. Thankful for the presence of each one. We have some more of our kids in this week, and we're mighty glad for that. And thankful to God for the safe trip the Canes have had to be with us, and thankful for some that have been sick that are back. But everybody here is welcome, and we're happy to be with you. We began a study here a few weeks ago. I didn't intend for it to be a series, but it's a study from the book of Luke. If you'll turn over to Luke chapter 15, we'll plan, Lord willing, today to see if we can bring this series to a close. But in Luke 15, a very familiar story is found there about a certain man that had two sons, verse 11. Verse 12 of Luke 15 reads, "And the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me.' And he divided them his living. Not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with," the old translation says, "riotous living." The word here is the word asotia, unsaved living. We can imagine what all that might have involved. I know that his older brother later on accused him in verse 30 of wasting the money that came to him from the father with harlots. It may be true. But in this passage, we find the picture of a young man who has certainly made a mess of his life. "And when he had spent all," verse 14 says, "there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his field to feed swine. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husk the swine did eat, and no man gave to him." There's a word that we've been talking about. It's the word regret. It's used a few times in the Bible, but it's not used in this passage, but boy, you can see it all over this passage, can you not? And I got to thinking about that idea of regret. Regret is that bitter feeling as we look back on our behavior, things that we did, things that we didn't do, things that we can't take back, can't go back in time, but if we could, boy, I'd do that differently. And we made the point early on in this study that there's a great value to young people in thinking about this subject, because as young people, you haven't made as many mistakes. You haven't made as many regrets. And boy, if you can avoid them, that's a great blessing. I hope today, as we close, we'll make the point that it's not hopeless for us if we make a mistake. And I don't want this lesson to be a hopeless or a discouraging lesson. I want to scare you. I want you to know that the things that you do today or tomorrow, the words that come out of your mouth, the decisions you make, the people you go with, they can affect the rest of your life. And you can look back in great regret at some decision you made, something that you did. You knew it wasn't right at the time, but you compromised yourself, and later on, it's a bitter memory. And so we've been looking at, and particularly the book of Luke. It's interesting how many of these lessons we might find in Luke. So in looking at the book of Luke, we looked at a lesson earlier in the 14th chapter when Jesus taught about the man who might be invited to come to this banquet, and there are places that are more or less honorable to sit. And so what this young man does is he just comes and plops himself down in the chief chair, and then maybe later on he's asked, "Well, you need to just get up and move. We got somebody better than you coming." And how shameful that is. And Jesus said, in essence, let another man honor you and not yourself. And we talked about how different that is in the world in which we live. where self-promotion and self-aggrandizement is the norm. That's the smart thing to do, and you just need to get out there and muscle your way up to the front and shout the loudest, and that's the guy who's ahead of things. And actually, if you're a Christian, you know that's not so. Well, we also talked about the story in Luke chapter 9 when Herod had given the order to kill John the Baptist. Not as much in Luke, but in Matthew's account, what we find is the circumstances of that. John had been arrested to start with because he had the courage to stand up and say, you're married to your brother's wife. That's not lawful. It's not right for you to have her. And that woman that he had married, the second wife, she was fit to be tied. And I'm sure she was encouraging this, and Herod was a proud man. He had John put in prison. And that's probably where it would have ended. But, this woman was burning with anger, and she could not get over it. So, I don't know how far the plan was concocted, but her daughter danced for Herod in a lewd way, I suppose, and got him to make a rash promise. He'd just give her whatever she wanted to have. And she said, well, all right, I'll tell you what my mother says. Give me the head of John the Baptist, and we'll be square. And so Herod was not happy to hear that. But the Bible says, for the sake of his oath and those who were there with him, he went ahead and gave the order. And later on, when he heard about the work of Jesus in more detail, he thought, well, this is just John the Baptist's ghost come after me. I imagine he saw a lot of ghosts. I don't know how much conscience he had, but whatever he had wasn't comforting to him. And we make the point, sometimes you can be in the wrong crowd, and everybody's doing it, and everybody says, go ahead. And everybody says, well, it won't hurt you one time. And everybody says, well, you got a right to be wrong. You never do. And if I'm that foolish that I make that choice, I may regret it for the rest of my life. It may shorten my life. Regrets that come because we are not strong enough to have first of all, the good judgment to stay out of some company. And when we are in that company, maybe not even by our choice, that we have the character that's willing to be different and not be conformed. And we looked at this passage that we just read from. And we talked about that prodigal. And it's a great story of how the prodigal is welcomed back home, and he does not die in obscurity or in sin or on maybe on in the pigsty. That's a great thing. But I'll tell you, even though forgiveness is there, the scars are still there. And he gave away his purity, and he wasted all of the money, the good inheritance that he could have had. Oh, there are a lot of things that sin cost us, even if we do come to ourselves. And that's why it's better not to go down that road to start with. That's what I'm pleading with you to remember. Whatever age we are, to remember. Because sin is expensive. It's always expensive. Even if it doesn't cost us our soul, it costs us. And we have to live with that shame. And I think last time we were looking at Luke 16:18. This is Luke's account of the marriage law. And in Luke 16:18, whoso puts away his wife and marries another commits adultery. And whoso marries her that is put away from her husband commits adultery. What a remarkable story that is. Now, Jesus here gives a law that's still shocking to people today. And in that, somebody's got a phone going, I think. So, okay, there you go. Thank you, darling. Thank you. So in that story that Jesus tells here, in this confrontation, I should say, with the Pharisees, he makes the point, you think me to be a libertine because I told you this story of the unjust steward, and how that he was in his own way wiser than many righteous people? He said, let me tell you something. You all don't respect God's law of marriage, but it is nevertheless the law that still exists. And what it says is shocking to people. There's still folks who've never read this before. That's frightening, but it's true. Whoso puts away his wife, divorces his wife, and marries another, commits adultery. And if you marry one put away, you commit adultery. Now you just imagine, here's a person, a young man, maybe he's never been married before, could be a young woman, never been married before, and they find somebody and they say, oh, this person, I just love them. Now they have been married before and their spouse is still living, but you know, I'm sure that's not a problem. Well, they were put away. And so they marry, and then sometime later they get to read the Bible and they say, what are we going to do now? Well, we're going to have to get out of adultery is what we're going to have to do. But think about all of the pain that's going to cause. And there may be children involved. I say all this to say, I'm not re-preaching the lesson from last time, but just to make the point quickly. You know, I've sat across the table on more than one occasion with people who have said to me, maybe you've had the same experience, it's heartbreaking. And you'll show them this verse. I found out it's best to ask people their circumstance first and then go to the text. If you start out with the text, then whatever the text says is what they did, sometimes. But in this case, what they did and what the text said, just two different things. There it is. And they'll say things like, they see the point. But they'll say things like, well, it's just, I was so young. We were just kids. I didn't know. And I'm sure every one of those things is true. But here's the thing, and I'll say this again, especially to emphasize to our young people. You stand up before somebody in the presence of witnesses, and you say before God, I do, till death do us part, for better or worse. God holds you to that. And if you're so young, then you better not be doing it till you're old enough to know what that means and realize that you're ready to make that kind of commitment. And imagine the regret on the part of so many who find out that they have violated the law. Now, I want to this morning to mention a couple of others quickly. From the book of Luke. And I'd like you to go over to Luke 22, another familiar story that I think certainly comes under the category of bitter regret. Luke 22 and verse 54, they took him and led him and brought him into the high priest's house, and Peter followed afar off. All of us know what he's talking about here. This is Jesus being taken by his enemies during his trial, the Jewish portion of his trial, and Peter following afar off. Verse 55, and when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall and were set down together, Peter sat down among them, among the enemies of Jesus, among those who had brought him. And a certain maid beheld him, that is Peter, as he sat by the fire, and earnestly looked upon him and said, this man also was with them. And he denied him, saying, woman, I know him not. And after a little while another saw him and said, thou art also of them. Peter said, man, I am not. And about the space of 1 hour after, another confidently affirmed, saying, of a truth this fellow was also with him, for he is a Galilean. And Peter said, man, I know not what thou sayest. And immediately, while he yet spake, the cock crew, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked upon Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how that he had said to him, before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice, 3 times. And Peter went out and wept bitterly, bitterly, bitterly. Peter certainly had been warned. If you look back in the previous chapter in Luke 22, verse 31, the Lord said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. But I prayed for you that your faith fail not. And when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. the Lord gave him a warning, and Peter was sort of offended by that warning. He thought, well, I don't know why you talk to me that way. You think I'm going to give up on you? You think I'm going to let you down? I'm not going to let you down. Very confident in himself. Has that ever happened to you? Don't answer out, but I'm just looking back in your life. There have been times when somebody tried to tell you, and I said, oh, no, I got this. I got it. Yeah, we had it all right. We got run over by it. Verse 33, the Lord said to, Peter to Jesus now, I am ready to go with thee to go to prison to death. I tell you, Peter, the cock shall not crow this day before thou thrice deny that you know me. And of course, they were all incredulous, but the Lord knew exactly what he was talking about. Peter had been warned. We've been warned, have we not? How many times has the Lord pled with us to be faithful to him, not to be distracted by this world? But how well do we do? We all remember, everybody that knows anything about the Bible has heard this story about Peter denying Jesus. But I ask you the question, doesn't that happen today? And maybe we've been guilty of the same thing. You know, we go to work for years, go to school for 12 years. And here we are in junior high school, our later years, and then senior, then college, maybe. And we've been there for years, going to school with the same people, and nobody knows we're Christian. How's that possible? How is that possible? Worse than that. You have situations where maybe some dirty joke is told and we'll laugh along with it. Things that are shameful, things that would make the Lord angry. But I'm standing over there with them and the Lord's over there. How is that different, really? Even worse, you know, here are people and they blaspheme God and they have all kind of ugly things to say, and I just sit there and I'm quiet. Is that not a way in which we deny the Lord? Here's the point. I won't look back on that and be proud of it. That's a promise. In Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 6, the Hebrew writer who is trying desperately to get these Hebrew Christians not to go back to the world and not to surrender their faith, he said, there are some that have deserted Christ, and they are crucifying the Son of God again and publicly disgracing him. You see yourself in that picture? That when I let the Lord down, when I'm quiet, when I ought to speak up, and when I'm joining in when people are shaming him, how is that different than what Peter did? How is that not something that I will bitterly regret later? If I don't find the regret in this life, I surely will in the life to come. In Matthew chapter 10, these are chilling words to me, and I hope they are to all of us. Matthew chapter 10, our Lord once told his disciples, he said, whoever shall confess me before men, him will I confess before my Father which is in heaven. That's good. But whosoever will deny me before men, him will I deny before my Father which is in heaven. The idea of confessing Christ, I can't remember now the word. I think it's exomologeo, some big old word like that. But it literally means to say the same outward. That's what the word means. That's what confession means. So one of these days, Christ will confess us if we confess him. What does it mean to confess Christ? We stand up before an audience and we say, for example, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and I don't care who knows it. We say, he says he's the Son of God, and I say he's the Son of God. We say the same outward. But what if in this life I fail to confess him? That he likewise will fail to confess me. One of these days when I'm standing before his throne, if it was such that I could say, well, Lord, I'm one of yours. And he would say to me, I don't know you. That's a chilling thought. If you deny me before men, I will deny you before my Father which is in heaven. Still today, denying the Lord brings great regret, eternal regret if things don't change. Let me look at one more. In Luke, the 16th chapter, there's another great story here, familiar to all of us. But let's read it again, that it might be especially meaningful to us in this study. Jesus told a story about a certain rich man. He was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. I don't know some different translations. That's the old translation, sumptuously. I seem to have read that the word there in the original has to do with the idea of light, brilliantly, maybe something like that. And so it's the idea of somebody who's lives in luxury, shining existence. And there's the other fellow, the other end of the scale, named Lazarus. This fellow doesn't have enough to eat, doesn't have enough to wear. His health is terrible. He has so little. He desires to be fed with the crumbs. He'd be happy with the scraps. And it just so happens he's at this fellow's gate. Isn't it amazing how people can read this story and think that Jesus here is blaming one man for being rich and the other man for not? Is that all we can charge this man with, just being rich? How about being rich and letting a fellow die at your gate without even noticing him or caring about him? That might be another little problem. I don't think being rich was his problem. His heart was his problem. Anyway. So it came to pass, verse 22, that the beggar died. And how things changed. He was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. Let me just offer this thought in passing. This is a story here. The language is perhaps there's some figure in this language. I don't think it represents falsehood. What happens when the righteous die? Well, we know what happens to their body. We see that. We have to tend to that. What happens to their spirit? I like to think about this phrase. And how far to press it, I don't know. I just like to think about it. Carried by the angels. That's a great thought. You know, those of us who are getting older might need some reassurance once in a while and think that if we hold to the Lord, what a blessing it will be to be carried by the angels. We don't know the way. That's okay. There'll be somebody there to help us. So, this man who had nothing and suffered a lot in this life found a great end. He must have been a man who loved God and did what he could with what he had. The rich man also died, maybe at the same day for all I know. He was buried. I don't know what happened to the other fellow's body, but the rich man was buried, but now he's no longer a rich man. He lifts his eyes up. He's in hell, in Hades, in torments. And he sees Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom, and he cried, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue. I am tormented in this flame. Here's the simple point. The greatest, the ultimate regret is to realize that you are lost, eternally, hopelessly lost in the only way that really matters. I don't have much time, young people. I'm not blaming. I'm just wondering out loud how much time young people, especially folks who are not in audiences like this, think about their soul. Death seems so remote. Young folks are bulletproof. Don't you know that? They're going to live forever and nothing will ever happen to them. That's why they run down the road at 98 miles an hour, while they're getting something out of the back seat. Because how can anybody do that? Well, because they just did not dream anything could happen to them. Reckless. Not everybody, not all young people, but it's a symptom that's typical. But the truth is, older people die, younger people die, all of us die. And when we die, what will we have to show for our life? 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that we may receive the things done in the body, in our body, whether it be good or bad. So everything that we bring to the judgment will be our record, whatever it is. Not our money, not our things, but our record. And if we have a record that does not please God, how poor we will be. You know, it's easy in this life to be distracted by things. There are a lot of things that are useful. But that story again in Luke, the 10th chapter, that we all remember, the story of Mary and Martha. Who could forget Jesus' words? Martha, thou art careful and troubled about many things, but one thing is needful. Let me say what you've heard before, but I'll say it again. I trust you've heard this many times at home, but let me say it again. Say it to our young people. You know, how much money you make, how nice your car is, or how many cars you got, or how big your house is, whether you're the star of the team. There are a lot of things that may have a place in life. They may have a use, but they're not necessary. You know the thing that's necessary? What's important, what's essential is where you stand with God right now. That's what's essential. That's true about me as well. To make it, everything else is secondary and will be of zero value if I check out of this life today. What matters, the one thing that's needful that Jesus said, is our relationship with Him. So that story again in Luke chapter 12, we just flip over another page, and the Lord seems to emphasize this point, doesn't He? Because we find this story included in Scripture. There's a fellow there listening to Jesus preach, believe it or not, but all he can think about is, you know, there's been obviously a death in the family, and there's an inheritance that has to be doled out, and my brother, maybe he's the executor of the will, he treat me right, and so he just interrupts the Lord and says, well, you tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. You get this straight. And Jesus says, interesting answer. He said, who made me a judge or a ruler, divider over you? Well, he does have all authority, doesn't he? Well, he will. But he didn't come to judge that. But what he knew was this man had a deeper problem that you don't remember, you don't know that one thing is needful. And so he says to him in verse 15, take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consists not in the abundance of the things he possesses. Then he told that unforgettable story about a certain man, wealthy man, planter, farmer, ground brought forth plentifully. And we see his thinking. And his thinking is, what am I going to do? I have no room to bestow my fruits. Excuse me. Notice the personal pronoun and its use over and again. And then he said, behold, this will I do. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But verse 20 says, God said to him, thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. And then who shall these things be which thou hast provided? So is he that lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. If I do that, it will be the greatest regret. If I spend my life on things that are not necessarily immoral, but they're just not the thing that's essential. And if I die in that kind of poverty, I may die leaving all kind of riches behind, but I die poor spiritually. It's awful to think about. And some people wait too late to make any changes. There's a great story again in Luke, the 23rd chapter this time. And here's the story about Jesus' crucifixion. And they crucified Jesus, you remember, among criminals. They wanted the world to think of him as a criminal. And so there were these two malefactors that were to be put to death with him. And they bring him out and crucify him, and Jesus says those words, verse 34, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. They parted his raiment and cast lots, and the people, they derided him, and the soldiers, they mocked him. And we find out, reading all the accounts, that actually the thieves likewise mocked him as well, but one of them had a change of heart. One of the malefactors, which were hanged, railed on him, saying, verse 39, saying, if thou be the Christ, save thyself and us. But the other answered, rebuking him, saying, dost thou not fear God, seeing thou art in the same condemnation? We indeed justly. We receive the due reward of our deeds. This man has done nothing amiss. And he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come in your kingdom. This day thou shalt be with me in paradise. What a great story that is. But it certainly reminds us of this sad reality that some people never learn. As far as I know, one of these thieves died in his sin. Some people never learn. And they'll face God, poor, lost, and unprepared. God forbid. God forbid. It'd been better if these men had never committed the crimes they did, but at least for one of them, he found the Lord before it was too late. He couldn't avoid the suffering in this life, but he could avoid the suffering in the life to come. Let me end on a positive note. We've been talking about some heavy subjects and some heavy passages. But I hope we all know that regret can only be overcome, and it can be overcome, through repentance and through forgiveness. We talked a good bit about Peter in these examples. But I do find it interesting. After Peter had committed that awful disloyal action and betraying the Lord 3 times while he was being tried for his life, it's interesting that after his resurrection, that the angel was sent to tell the women not only that Jesus was raised from the dead, but I want you to go tell Peter. Why go tell Peter? I thought Peter was the guy that let you down. Yeah, but the Lord not giving up on Peter. There's still work for him to do. There's still hope for him as he will serve God. And of course, that's exactly what he does. And in John chapter 21, we all remember that story also, where Jesus, I don't know, confronts is the right word, but challenges Peter. Simon, do you love me? Oh, you know I love you. Well, feed my sheep. 3 times he does that. I wonder if that's a coincidence. He denied him 3 times. He has to confess him 3 times. Feed my sheep. And that's exactly what Peter does. We all know that. We know the story of how Peter goes on to be this apostle of the Lord. He's the one who opens the door to the kingdom. In Acts 2, he lives his life and dies for the cause of Christ, serving as a shepherd along the way. What a great story of redemption. Of course, Paul's story of redemption is also hard to forget. Paul writes in a couple of letters to Timothy that we have. And in 1 Timothy, he writes, and he is all too able to remember his years of persecution of the church. He said, I was a blasphemer. We know what that is. A persecutor. The idea of a persecutor is someone who chases another. Injurious. Injurious is from a word which means to this proud kind of arrogant, angry behavior. cruel. Paul calls himself in this context the chief of sinners. But Paul, with all those regrets and things that he certainly could never forget, did not lose hope in the grace of God. He believed in God's promise of forgiveness. And at the end of his life, I'm sure if you ask him about those things, he could remember every one of them, but he also knew he was a forgiven man. And so in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 6, he can write the words, I'm ready to be offered. A lot of times Paul had faced death. He thought this was the last time. And he said, be it so, it's well. I fought a good fight. I finished the course. I've kept the faith. There's laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give to me, not to me only, but to all those that love his appearing. So here's the point. Best thing we can do is try to avoid the regrets that sin brings. But those of us who have those regrets need not die with them and die in sin. We can turn to a loving God who will help us back up, who will wash us off, who will give us another opportunity and give us a hope and a purpose and a future in a place where there'll be no more sorrow, no more tears, no more regrets. And I hope and pray that'll be the choice that you and I make. We are each going to have to make our own choice. May the Lord help us to make the right one. I appreciate your kind attention. Please, if you would, get your songbook out, turn to the number that's been selected. If it be your desire this morning to become a child of God, it has to be that we are ready to say goodbye to a life where we're on the throne of our heart and sin rules our conduct. We got to throw that away. That's what repentance is. Turn to God and say, I believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God, to make that confession publicly, and to say, I want to be his servant. He will be my Lord. I want to be buried with him in baptism, raised to walk in newness of life. That's what I desire. And that's the way I'll live, by that promise. If you want to do that today, we'd be glad to help you. If you're here as one who is a child of God and you've made that commitment, but you've not been faithful to the Lord to whom you've made it, then make that right. The Lord longs to receive you. Don't live any longer in regret. And you'll be glad to find the relief that comes with forgiveness. If we can help you in any way, pray with you and for you. Let us know how right now while we stand, and Darren leads us in song.